So I would be honored to introduce Kevin Ott, if I'm pronouncing your last name correctly.
Yeah.
Okay. Kevin Ott works as a penetration tester and a red teamer at Exploit Labs in Germany. Currently, he's focused on developing the red team's capabilities with automation and countermeasures and other custom engagements. Before joining the offensive security community, Kevin had worked in a technical analyst position for network engineering for a global financial institution. And when there is not a global pandemic, Kevin enjoys all sorts of outdoor sports, including mountain biking and rock climbing, which I am also an avid rock climber. So it's nice to see a fellow climber in the security community. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it off to you, Kevin.
Okay.
So I just made you presenter, Kevin, and once you get slides up and you feel comfortable, we'll drop off and let you do your thing.
Okay, that looks like my screen is sharing.
Yeah, it looks like we've got your speaker view right now. I don't know if you want to do a presenter view for your slides or not. If you're ready,
Yeah,
then
let me quickly bring this up. So
Perfect.
It should be looking good now.
Excellent. We'll drop out a video here, and if you need us, just yell.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm looking forward. So this is actually my first talk at a bigger international conference. So please be nice to me, especially when it comes to questions. I want to start off with, that was a quick introduction, just want to complete it. Yeah, as I said, I'm a penetration tester at Exploit Labs in Germany, focusing mostly on red teaming, assumed breach, and classical penetration testing with my kind of specialties is TTP development, Active Directory penetration tests, and also network attacks. And so I want to go into why I came up with this talk and my motivation behind it, because over the last years, we've seen an increase in supply chain attacks. So as red teamers, we need to adapt to this kind of new threat to help the blue team on the other side to understand this kind of threat, because in, let's say, traditional penetration testing, we just go ahead and plug our laptop into the network and just go ahead, scan, and attack. Or if we, on the other hand, have classic red teaming, we do all this kind of phishing or physical attacks and use that to achieve initial compromise. But with supply chain attacks, we are in a bit of a struggle as red teamers because, and this is more or less the main topic of my talk, we cannot just go ahead and compromise a third party to simulate or emulate a third supply chain attack. So with this talk, I want to demonstrate methods on how to build a simulation for this kind of supply chain attacks. And I think the most important part is to understand why we as red teamers need to simulate this attacks, and that's why I want to go into a few of the recent supply chain attacks that we've seen in the wild. The first being back in 2017, MEDoc, which is a Ukrainian accounting software, and it actually had to be used by any company that was doing business in Ukraine. And when it was compromised, they had their infrastructure compromised, and their official software was used to distribute the NotPetya malware. And I think it made the news pretty much, especially because Maersk, the global shipping company, was one of the biggest, or was one of the companies that was hit the worst. And they almost got their whole network encrypted, like backups, domain controllers, everything. And I think pretty much the only reason why the company survived is they found a single backup domain controller somewhere in Ghana, in one of the offices in Ghana, that was offline during the attack because they had a blackout. And that's the only reason they could restore their Active Directory and didn't go complete and didn't have to start over from scratch. I think in the end it came out to over 300 million of damages just from this attack. And there's a story from Vice that shines a light on all the different aspects of the attack of the attack on Maersk. And while it's entertaining to read, I think it almost reads like a thriller. It's a super horrifying story. So I can recommend just everyone reading it. I've linked it in the slides, and I hope that the slides will be available afterwards. The second one is also in 2017, was CCleaner. CCleaner is actually owned by Avast, the antivirus company, and it was also CCleaner was also compromised in 2017, and they used the official CCleaner installer to spread a multi-stage malware that was distributed to over, or that was at least downloaded over 2 million times. But in an investigation, Avast said that only about eight organizations got the second stage payload. But in the end, it's still pretty bad if the malware gets downloaded 2 million times, and they can just choose where to distribute the second stage. And the last that I want to go over is, of course, SolarWinds. Started last year, still going into this year. The fallout is still being handled. And yeah, there was the Trojanized SolarWinds Orion update that also distributed a multi-stage loader dubbed Sunburst. And as a second stage, they delivered Cobalt Strike to actually go into the network and steal data from various high-profile companies such as Microsoft, FireEye, but also government agencies. I think just Microsoft and Fire are probably most prominent because they, in the end, managed to detect it, with FireEye being the one that found some suspicious activities in their two-factor software. And the actor is currently tracked by FireEye as UNC 24252. And so we have three pretty big attacks that leverage supply chain attacks. So it would just make sense as a red teamer to say, okay, for our clients to be prepared against this kind of attack and to practice this kind of attack in a real-world environment, we would need to simulate it. But our struggle as a red teamer is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, we cannot just compromise something like CCleaner or SolarWinds to distribute our payload, and they also wouldn't just give us permission to just use their network to distribute our payloads. So in regards to the limitations of red teaming in this scenario, when we look at the adversary tools, techniques, and procedures, we can see that most of them used either a stolen or abused a third-party code signing certificate through the infrastructure. And that's what I mentioned, is that we cannot simulate this. If we as red teamer go to CCleaner and say, hey, can you give us your code signing certificate for red team engagement? They would probably show us the door, and for the right reasons. So that's I think the biggest problem in this kind of scenario. The adversaries use software that is signed with a valid certificate, which we can simply not do, at least not with a certificate of the original software. And the second thing is, and the solution for this kind of scenario in a red team engagement would be just to use self-signed code signing certificates. Just buy the code signing certificates for your company. Well, what we sometimes do is we have an internal CA running, and we just distribute that CA certificate to the client to install it on the server where we run our software. And the second problem is distribution. So the adversary used the official infrastructure of the compromised companies to distribute the malware, which is again something that we cannot do. We cannot just go ahead and compromise their infrastructure to spread out or to deliver our payload. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that would break several laws independent of if you're in Germany or in the US. So the solution we've taken with this is the assume breach approach, and that's what I want to talk about more in depth now. So I'm obviously not the first one to talk about this. There are a lot of talks from Tim Medin of Red Siege that I also recommend if you need or if you want more information about the assume breach approach. But I just want to give a quick overview of how, as a red teamer, you can also use assume breach to simulate a successful supply chain attack. I think this is a pretty good graphic that shows what the assume breach paradigm in the end means. Is that instead of trying to prevent breach, you give the red team access to your internal network and start the red team from there. So instead of trying to phish in a more traditional setting, instead of trying to phish several hundred employees or do spear phishing, you just say, okay, client, here's our payload, you just run it, and from there we start the red team engagement, which has the big advantage of not having to do all this phishing and spending a lot of time on building phishing campaigns, but simulating what's also important, which is lateral movement in the internal network. And before I go more in depth on how to do this and how to or how our methodology looks like, there's one more thing I want to go over, which is the difference between simulation and emulation, which is something that comes up a lot when we talk to our clients. And the main difference is that when we emulate an adversary, that we try to copy the tools, techniques, and procedures that they used as close as possible. And that's why we usually, in a supply chain attack scenario, we don't do emulation, because there would just be too many TTPs, as I mentioned in the last slides, that we just cannot copy. So we do more of a simulation. We say we choose some software, we backdoor it, and then we distribute it to the client. And that's exactly our approach to assume breach in a supply chain scenario, is that we start by gathering intelligence data. So for example, CCleaner compromise, SolarWinds compromise, how did they do it? What did they, how did they backdoor their software? Was it single stage, multi-stage? And then based on the intelligence data we collected, we build a threat profile that matches as close as possible these intelligence data that we found, build our backdoor software, send that software to the client, then the client runs the backdoor software like they would in a real supply chain attack. And from there, it's a scenario-based penetration test or red teaming, depending if they have a blue team or not. So I like to call it, especially with some of our clients, like a red team assessment with training wheels, because it focuses on one part of the red team engagement, which still leaves them the chance to run a full red team engagement somewhere along the line. But this can also be like the first step when trying to do a red team, but as a company, they feel that they're not completely ready to run a full red team assessment. And depending on how close you want the, here's says still emulation, but depending on how close you want the simulation to be to the original TTPs, that can involve a lot of development work and preparation, because you have to tailor the software for a specific engagement. But again, as I said, it still saves us the effort to build complex phishing campaigns that in the end fail, and then we need to do assume breach anyway. So that's why we like this approach. We just say assume breach from the start and just leave the phishing for a different campaign and leave that to the awareness campaigns. So in regards to the threat intelligence and threat profile, that's what I mentioned, is that we collect IOCs and TTPs of the actors that we want to simulate. And for example, we make during the intelligence gathering phase, we also say, do we want to use open source tools, or do we want to commercial tools, or do we go custom? And we then use all these gathered information based on or from the TTPs of, for example, the supply chain attacks, to build a threat profile. And there's a really good guide by the guys that wrote the red team book. I think it's Joe West. I forgot the other name. And an example for the intelligence or the information that we use to build our threat profile is the SolarWinds and Sunburst backdoor. And here, for example, you can see the code. And if the client wants to simulate, for example, this, we would download the Orion software and then go through all the reports that we can collect on the internet and try to build a backdoor that's as close to the original as possible. That's exactly the point that I want to go over next, is building the backdoor software. We usually look for popular C# based software just because it's quicker and more easy to modify. There's also lots of knowledge and tools in the public domain when it comes to C# that you can use, for example, to load your shell code. And for us, the important thing is that we always look for software that does not force integrity checks on the DLLs that are loaded, and that has no code obfuscation. Luckily, there's plenty of this kind of software. So I want to give a small demo how we usually go ahead when we try to backdoor the software to and before we send it to a client. And for that, we would use Keepass. And quickly go into, is it still sharing? Yeah, okay. Quickly go into my Windows VM. Oh. And there is the demo. Okay. I think my VM broke. That is put on my backup. Okay, there we go. Would be too easy if it would work the first time. Okay, so maybe while the machine is restoring, quickly go over the tools that we usually use. I personally prefer DNSpy, although it has been, I think, end of life and is not actively maintained anymore. It's still a pretty nice piece of software because you can actually change things in the binary. So I've already downloaded Keepass. Let me put this in full screen mode. I already downloaded Keepass portable for this small demo. So we have the normal Keepass executable here. Okay, and so now we would go ahead and load that into DNSpy. And open tools Keepass. So now DNSpy shows us all the different dependency of Keepass. We can go into the Keepass code, and as we open the main program, we can, after decompiling, already see that there is no code obfuscation employed. So we get the original code, and so we can just here on the program class that's called upon program start, go ahead and say edit class. And then I always like to just go to the bottom and add a different function. Let's say call that public. We need to call it, we need to do it static so we don't have to initialize the class. We don't want it to return anything. And then we call it not a backdoor because it's obviously not a backdoor. And then for this demo, let's just use small message box. So the problem is with the message box that it wouldn't normally be able to call if there are dependencies that we do not load in the original binary. So we can just go up here and we see that it already uses system Windows Forms where message box is located. But if we would use some kind of method or object that's not already in the dependencies for this kind of for this class, we would need to add it in the to the import statements, to the using statements. And now I don't find my class anymore. So, and the next thing that we need to do is for this to be actually applied to compile it. And because we don't have the original source code, but the decompiled source code, it can sometimes happen, if you don't make mistakes, that you get error messages from the original source code. Then you can just go through it. And for example, here there's an error message, so we just commented out. During testing, there was no adverse effects when commenting this out, but in a real engagement, we would probably be more careful. Then this has to be with the out. And we need to assign flag to false. And now if we compile it, there's no more errors. We can see that our not a backdoor function is in the function list. And now we could go into the main function. We see that main priv is called. So we go into the main priv. And oops, then we go in the main priv, we say edit method. And in this method, we now would add our not a backdoor function. Compile it again. Close the nspy. It asks us if we want to save the file. We just overwrite the existing file. And now our Keepass binary you can see that it was originally signed. Now it's not signed anymore. It still has all the parameters. It has the icon. It looks like a normal Keepass binary, but the problem is now that because we don't have, because it's not signed or the signature doesn't match anymore, when we would try to open it, there would normally be a smart screen that I already clicked away during testing, so there's no smart screen. But we now have our backdoor Keepass binary, and it would load like it would normally do. So normal software, but with a small backdoor in it that in an assumed breach engagement we can use to simulate this this kind of supply chain attack. And if we have, for example, our own certificate authority and imported our certificate into the VM, we could just go ahead, strip the original, okay, and then let me create a self-signed certificate. So this is the new PowerShell command that replaced the make cert. If we now go into certificates and personal, we can see that we have the totally not a backward Keepass certificate. And now we could go ahead and say, okay, we want our binary signed. And now if we look at our Keepass binary properties, we can see that we have a valid, or we have a digital signature, but Windows correctly says that, hey, the signature does not complete the chain of trust because it's from a provider that we don't know. So in an assumed breach type of engagement, you could just, as I said, tell the client, just run it and it's fine. Or if you want to really simulate a valid certificate, just build a small CA certificate, use that to create a code signing certificate, and then send the client your CA certificate so he can import that into the client or server where you run the software, and then you can really simulate an attacker that has a valid certificate, a valid code signing certificate. All right, then back to the presentation. So in addition to what I've just showed and what I normally do, if we have a client engagement where the client wants to test all his network solutions as well, like sandboxes, to see if it gets caught, we usually put the backdoor function in some kind of UI element that would need interaction with the application. For example, in Keepass, you would use the button to create a new entry in Keepass. You would use the new create a new entry in Keepass, because if you use something that requires interaction in the program, then sandbox solutions wouldn't be able to trigger your payload if it's not triggered on loading the application, because the sandbox normally doesn't know how to put multiple menus to trigger the payload. And as I mentioned, we do not have a code signing certificate from the original vendor of the software, so we need to help ourselves out and use a self-signed certificate, or just go ahead and buy a valid code signing certificate. Then, of course, it's not the original certificate, but it's still a valid code signing certificate, so you can simulate that use case. And of course, one important factor when you build your backdoor software, if you need antivirus or EDR evasion, that for us mostly depends on the kind of engagement we run. We have clients that say we just turn it off for the initial compromise, and then we see if you, for example, manage to bypass EDRs on other servers. But we also have clients that say we have EDR running and antivirus running, and we want to see how they react. And these are mostly the clients that say we also import the certificate, so we can see how our security solutions react when a validly signed executable runs code that it shouldn't be running. Okay. So after we've built our backdoor software, the next step would obviously be how to distribute our payload. And for this, it's easy for us if we just clone the target's website, register a lookalike domain, and host a tool there. Again, this is one of the biggest limitations you have independently if you use red team approach or assume breach approach. For supply chain attack simulations, we cannot just use the infrastructure that the software vendor uses to distribute the software like they did in the attacks that I mentioned before, because we do not have access. So we need just to try to stay as close as possible to the original domain. And from there, but this is still enough to test proxy solutions, sandboxing solutions, to see how they would react to someone downloading this kind of binary, for example. And for the assumed breach assessment, the client then just downloads the backdoor binary, runs it on a workstation or server, dependent on the targeted scenario. If you want to simulate CCleaner, you would run it on a workstation. If you want to simulate something like Orion, you would run it on a server in a data center probably. And after the client is run, I mean, this is probably for most red teamers and pentester the fun part, because it's a full-on red team or scenario-based penetration test, including everything that we usually do: internal recon, lateral movement, privilege escalation, action objectives, stealing data. And I won't go in depth on this here because I will probably fill another 30 or 45 minutes. The good thing is, and that's what I mentioned before, we don't need the initial compromise part. In the red teamings we've seen that the initial compromise takes the most time. With the assumed breach assessment style, or with the assumed breach style red teaming or penetration test, we can just shave this time off of the assessment or use it to build more sophisticated and more tailored tools for the engagement at hand. So to summarize, with the supply chain attacks more and more on the rise, I mean, it's more or less the new hype, especially with SolarWinds. I think there are some more that I didn't even mention. As the red team, as pen testers, we must try to help our clients to simulate this kind of breach and help them prepare before it hits them. And we cannot do this without breaking without breaking any laws, because we cannot compromise any third-party software vendors. So the solution to the red teaming problem would be to use the assume breach approach and coordinate the effort with the client to bring the software into the network and see how an attacker would move through the network when he would be able to compromise a server or a workstation through a supply chain attack. And by using threat intelligence data and threat profiling, we can help emulate or simulate an attacker as close to the original as possible. So that would be it for my talk. I hope I'm good on time, and I think so. So from what I understood and what I think, I will be taking questions in Discord.
Absolutely.
Now would be, yeah.
Please, Delaney.
Thank you for presenting for us today with a live demo for your first talk, no less. That was